UX Podcast Episode 282.
I'm James Royal Lawson.
And I'm Pat Axbom.
And this is UX Podcast, balancing business, technology, people and society every other Friday for over a decade, and with listeners literally all over the world, from the Isle of Man to Turkey. Turkey. I'm going to practice saying it. Turkey.
Is that Turkey?
Because they've changed. Yeah, well, they've
changed it, yes.
Yeah, well, they've asked to change it, which is interesting that you have to ask to change your own name of your country. But they don't want to be associated with Turkey anymore, the bird. They want to be their own country. So, Turkey. Yeah, which is actually much more close to what we say in Swedish. Turkiet.
It is. Yes.
And Kalkon is Turkey. So, anyway, enough of the language lessons.
Moving on. Carolyn Wilson Nash is a lecturer at the University of Stirling, and together with Julie Tinson, who is Professor of Marketing also at Stirling University, have published together a research paper entitled I Am the Master of My Fate: Digital Technology Paradoxes and the Coping Strategies of Older Consumers.
So technology and the elderly, so older adults, is a topic that Per and I have been interested in for quite a while. I suppose partly because we hear people in our branch, anyway, using older people as a gauge of usability. If my mum could use it, then anyone can. But also because we, I think, actively exclude older people quite regularly from our work. So our app is, for millennials, for example.
Yeah. So Carolyn joins us to talk more about her research and the impact technology has on older people's lives.
Technology and the elderly is something that, I'm going to be turning 49 in a couple of weeks, and that means I've got parents that are a generation ahead of that. And I know from talking to my peers that it's an increasing burden is helping your parents, not just with all the kind of other matters of aging parents and maybe financial aspects, health aspects and so on, but the technology aspect of it is something I don't think I personally envisaged a while ago that I'd need to deal with as I got older. What is it? Tell me, can you share a little more about technology and the changing things to do with it now and the elderly?
Well, I think it's really hard because obviously you've got such a range of people within the sort of older adult group. So you've got ranges of people who have quite a lot of experience with technology, maybe people who've worked with technology in the past, who are aging, and those people absolutely fine with technology. But then obviously you have some people who might not have experiences of using much technology before, and now it's everywhere. It's around us. You have to use things like the internet to contact your doctor. Especially during COVID, you need to use the internet for internet banking. People communicate via the internet, and if you're not on it, you kind of almost are feeling left out. So having technology is becoming more of a necessity and less of sort of something we really want and desire. And there is sort of a group of people that don't have that experience from using it at work. Those group of people getting older, and it as you said, sort of, your parents getting older, you need to help them with technology. There is that sort of family element to it as well. So a lot of sort of people help their family. So I help my mum. My mum's just got a new computer, and I've helped her install that computer. There's sort of find a lot of grandchildren helping their grandparents with their technology as well. But the issues is it's not necessarily easy. I don't think technology has really been designed for you to just sort of turn it on and start using it. And it's really easy and it's laid out and, happy days. I think there are a lot of barriers to using technology. so for example, when I was setting up my mum's computer, it wasn't just sort of I turn it on, I follow the instructions, I set it up. She needed a Microsoft account, a Google account, all these passwords and security. And I was like, I just want her to turn it on because she's not going to remember a password. And also I set it up in my Microsoft account. So every time she logs on, it goes, "Hello, Carolyn," and she gets very confused. So there's just all these barriers. And I think we've gone almost too far on the security side. There's too much security. Why do you need 101 passwords to log into something? Why do you need 101 accounts to be able to use a device? Surely you should have the device and then you should be able to choose what accounts you want to link it with. And I think all of those barriers and all of those difficulties make it really difficult for someone to start using technology. And that's the issue is, sometimes you need to start using these devices, whether it's a computer or a mobile phone, or an iPad or a tablet or Kindle, whatever. But there are these sort of barriers as to start using that technology. And if you don't have someone to help you, so if you don't have a loving daughter or son or a grandchild to help you get connected and help you use that technology, it can be quite isolating. It can be extremely daunting. So that's kind of the issues with it, I would say.
I think the whole thing, the aspect you brought up at the beginning of that, about the fact that, I said elderly, and you pointed out that not all elderly are elderly, or rather, there's not one big clump. Younger elderly people. You mentioned about people who were working. I don't know if I've reflected about this so much that, I did say that I was almost 50, but looking back to when we started the podcast 10 years ago, that people that were like just a bit older than me and Per are now elderly effectively because they're over 65. So what kind of spans are we? It must vary a huge amount between those people who have work experience with computers and technology and don't.
Well, it's a really contentious term. So, like using the term, so the moment someone turns 65, if you turn around and say, "Oh, now you're elderly," I don't think they'd like that very much. So it is quite a contentious term. I use like older adults and generally refer to people sort of over 65 as an older adult. But again, that's contentious. Why do we use 65 as the cutoff? Why is 65 the retirement age cutoff? It's really difficult to know. So I think the best thing to do is not to sort of say that everyone over the age of 65 is the same. They're not all the same people or the same group. There's different people, different experiences, and different experiences of using technology as well. So the group probably between sort of 65 and early 70s now, the majority of that group will have worked with technology, and probably have quite a good experience of technology. And it might be, things change and they need to update their skills, or they might need to ask a few people for help with certain things, as we all do. I work in an institution and we've all been asking each other how to download Office 365, and you have that sort of collaboration with each other. But then there is sort of, I'd say, a generation above that maybe didn't work with technology at work, or maybe didn't have as much experience of it as sort of the younger, older generation. And I think it can be really, really difficult, because essentially you're trying to learn a new skill that you've never learned before, and you might be doing that with not very much help, and you might be learning that skill, but imagine the goalposts keep moving because things keep changing, and technology becomes more difficult, and there's more barriers put up. I think like a lot of the issue is that these technologies that are out there are traditionally designed or is thought of as being used by the younger consumer. So they're designed with the younger consumer in mind. They're probably tested on the younger consumer. And
also built by younger people.
Exactly, built by younger people for younger people.
And the perception as well, Per, I think about what you consider to be old when you're younger isn't as old as 65.
No, I know. I remember being at school and thinking that my teachers that were probably in their mid-20s were really old.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
but I think that's also a respect for people who are older than you as well. But yeah, younger generation designing for a younger generation without testing on sort of the older generations. And I think it's all about bringing the older adult voice into, into what they want from a technology. How can we design a technology so that there aren't these barriers? How can we design a technology so it's useful and fun? I think we always forget the fun side of technology. It's playful, it's enjoyable. Older adults use technology for its enjoyment as well as for its function and utility. And actually, what you find is a lot of the technologies that are designed for older adults tend to be designed for like specific purposes, like care needs. So that sucks the fun out of the technology because it all becomes about sort of the utility and the function. But really, we need to remember that it can be fun and playful as well. So yeah, it's about getting that voice into the technology development process, getting sort of the voice of the older consumer in there.
It's so interesting because that sounds to me like a huge missed opportunity with populations in a large number of countries just getting older and older. So that demographic is actually increasing in size, which means that if you are thinking of, in a commercial sense, there's a huge opportunity to actually build more fun stuff for that target group.
Yeah, absolutely. There's like a massive consumer group there. As you say, we are sort of in aging populations, and I mean, there's a lot there that is probably, needed by someone. But also there might be a lot there that we don't know about because it's a completely understudied group and untapped into market as well. So doing sort of more research into what older people want from a technology, how they use their current technology, how could we make it more usable, easier to use, less of these sort of security barriers. I mean, security is important. People do like that, but I think it's gone too far the other way.
In your research paper, Caroline, you touched on, well, one of the main findings of it was the paradox of the technological paradoxes. And this was interesting. I mean, you've touched on one which wasn't actually, I don't think, one of your paradoxes just now with the fun and utility. But you did have, I think it was 5 or 6 paradoxes. Do you want to share a little bit about those paradoxes and explain what they are?
Yeah. So paradox, it all comes from sort of Mick and Fournier paper back in 1998, and they found paradoxes of technology, which is basically when you're using a technology, there are these sort of conflicting emotions. So whilst you might feel in control of that technology, it can also cause huge amounts of chaos. So that would be one example of a paradox. So an example from the paper that Julie and I wrote is that I'll use that control chaos one, but so sort of an older person feeling in control of their mobile phone, they know how to use it, they know how to use the functions, but then at the same time that phone started randomly syncing with all their other devices. So loads of files moved from the phone to the pad to the computer, and there was absolute chaos. And they said, I think there was a quote there that their pocket was bulging with spam. And I loved that. I thought it was such a nice quote. But these things, sometimes they just happen and you don't know why. And I think technology has a way of creating those feelings of control, but also that absolute chaos when it comes, maybe something goes wrong, or maybe something happens that you're not totally in control of. And a paradox is obviously when it happens simultaneously and these things happen at the same time and create sort of like a conflict in yourself, which can sort of maybe create feelings of self-doubt a little bit, or maybe sort of anxiety or stress. So, I mean, there are quite a few paradoxes that we identified. Other ones are efficiency and inefficiency. So whilst you might find your device really efficient, with sort of, I looked at 4 different devices. So it was mobile phones or smartphones, even tablets, laptops, and e-readers at the time. So whilst your e-reader might be really useful for reading books and it's very efficient because you can download a book and read it, it might also be inefficient for other tasks, for example, like checking emails. So that's an example of where something might be efficient and inefficient at the same time. Then another one is assimilation and isolation. So assimilation is obviously that feeling of sort of being together with someone. And technology creates that. Like, technology is where you can communicate with someone, or technologies where you've got the same technology. It can create sort of a group of people bonding together. So a great sort of quote in the paper is that there was this woman and she was part of a book group. And within the book group, they almost had their scion of people who are Kindle users and people who weren't Kindle users. So by being a Kindle user, they had their group of people and they bonded over using their Kindle. And you have this with like Apple users and Microsoft users. Like, you have groups of technology users and they bond together. So
That's
not only
so
does
interesting.
it is really
because
interesting.
they're bonding. Because like in a book group, you'd expect to bond over the book you're reading, because that's the object. Whereas what you're saying there is that the Kindle itself became the object, because it is the object. It's not the physical book anymore for that group. It's the device. It's fascinating.
It is really interesting. So not only can devices create assimilation by sort of being a form of communication, but also bonding over sort of like-minded people using the same device. So that was sort of the assimilation side. And then the isolation side was actually quite interesting, because you wouldn't expect that from someone who uses technology. But it's very much like, it's a double-edged sword in that you, if you're part of that Kindle group, you're obviously isolating yourself from other people. So you can become so involved in your technology that you're actually isolating yourself from the outside world. So I think like another study that I did actually found that the more emotionally connected someone was to their technology, the less they felt a sense of belonging within the world. Which I think is quite interesting. So I think there's a balance there. I think you need technology to feel part of this sort of digital world that we're creating. But there's also, if you get too immersed in technology, and you see this with teenagers and video games, then you're not outside, you're not talking to people, you're not communicating with people, you've not got that face-to-face contact. You're essentially in an eternal COVID-19, which nobody wants. So that's how that creates that sort of feeling of isolation as well. And then another paradox is this sort of freedom enslavement paradox. So freedom is that technology gives you a lot of freedom and a lot of sort of autonomy. So an older person might use it to arrange to meet up with friends. They might use it to do their online shopping. They might use it to do things that they otherwise might not be able to do, which creates that sort of freedom from it, because there's so many different functions and uses from technology, which is excellent. But there's also this enslavement side where technology, you're dependent on things. So you're dependent on the latest software update, or you're dependent on battery power. It's as simple as that. And there's a story in the paper about 2 older ladies whose car broke down, and they had been given these smartphones, probably by their children, to use in an emergency, but neither of the smartphones had battery power. So they couldn't use them. And so you are still enslaved by this technology, or by sort of some of the requirements of the technology.
And in that situation, that example, I guess you've created a false reassurance, because they probably, I guess, felt at ease because they had these emergency devices, and then when it came to the actual emergency, the reassurance became stressful, I guess, because you couldn't use it.
Exactly. And I mean, it happened to me the other day. I was on a train, and you now get sort of e-train tickets on your phone. And and I had 2% battery left,
Oh,
and I was like, oh God, what do I do? So I was like, I put my phone onto flight mode. I was like, this might get me through the station. The ticket person comes through on the train, and I was like, look, I can show you, but please can you print me off a ticket, because my phone's going to die by the time I get to the station, and I need to get through the barriers. And she was like, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that.
Oh, so you need it when you get out as well, which means that you would be instantly trapped inside. Oh, wow.
Oh, ticketless. You're effectively
So-
ticketless.
Yeah.
I mean, I was freaking out, but we have now all this dependency on technology in our everyday lives, but we're still enslaved by having battery, and I'm going to carry a charger with me everywhere I go now. So yeah, that was another one. And then the fifth paradox is competence and incompetence. So when you use technology and when you use it right, you get this great feeling, like this great sort of sense of achievement. And you could see sort of, it was a diary study that we did, so a 6-month-long diary study of people using their specific technologies. And you could see when people had worked out technical difficulties, sort of the great feelings that they had. They were like, it worked, and exclamations like that. I feel great. But then on the other side of it, when it doesn't work, it creates these feelings of incompetence. And that was coming out quite a lot from the data, was people sort of almost blaming themselves if they couldn't use technology. So there were frustrations, there were people saying, is it me? Is it me doing something wrong? This one participant was saying, I was a CEO, and now I can't even get this iPhone to work. And people were almost sort of doubting themselves and their identity because they couldn't use technology. So that was another paradox that was coming up. And then the final one is attachment and non-attachment. So people were becoming sort of attached to their devices, and that they want them with them all the time, keeping them in their sort of breast pocket, keeping them close to them, so needed them for certain tasks, and then would feel sort of anxiety if the phone or the device wasn't with them. But then equally, there were these feelings of non-attachment and very much like, oh, good riddance. My laptop can have a holiday, and all of this. So that was the final paradox. So we identified 6 from that paper.
And when you speak about these all related really to control and chaos paradoxes, it really makes me think about how the elderly actually know about all this stuff, and how you were writing about, we forget that the elderly or older adults can also teach us about the things that can go wrong and to not trust technology. Because I love this quote that you had in the article from Christopher 83. There's one sure thing: life will come to an end and technology will always go wrong. And there's so much wisdom within these people who we tend to ignore and make fun of in depictions in media. We use them as examples of people who can't use technology. But flip that and realize that there is so much we could learn from them if we actually did involve them in the act of designing and making these products.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of the other side of the paper, as we identified these coping strategies that older adults are using or adopting to overcome the paradoxes. So just to say, like, these paradoxes, we all feel them with technology. It's not just older adults experiencing these paradoxes. They're all there. But we identified one specifically experienced by older adults. So sort of using that voice, understanding more of their experiences with technology. And yeah, we identified some really interesting coping strategies that were new, and we don't know if they're just coping strategies used by older adults or coping strategies that might be used by everyone. But one was that kind of acceptance, as you just mentioned, so that wisdom of, yes, people sort of might not have much experience with technology, but they have a lot of life experience and a lot of wisdom. And I think that gives people this perspective. So you mentioned, that quote about technology will always go wrong. so it's almost like you can take a step back and sort of see everything. And it's like, yeah, I've experienced all this in my life. All this is just a technology, just a piece of technology. And that was one of the coping strategies that we identified. But you're absolutely right. We can use that wisdom, we can use that knowledge to understand more about how older people use technology, and use that to help us design technology and devices for older people, or that's more usable for older people.
I mean, maybe one way to look at that as well is that a lot of the design, I say a lot, I'm thinking now about how we've been 10 years now with mobile and 20 years or so with the internet, that a lot of the design is based on the previous iteration of the technological design, so the digital design. Whereas when you think about the the older adults and the elderly brackets, that we're taking a step back and we're looking now at a broader perspective of a time that their life experiences span. Like if you're an older adult now, then you were probably born in the 40s or maybe the 50s or even earlier than that. So your life experience spans a much larger period of time. So how that then can be used. You say wisdom, but it's input into designing that maybe is neglected when you're in that world of iteration within digital that is within the 10 years that we've had now of mobile, 20 years of internet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely like an untapped. I don't want to just come from it from the marketing perspective and saying, you know, it's an untapped market. It's more from sort of the concerned marketer perspective, and kind of saying, yes, we need to design products for older people, but we also need to make sure that you know, it's for the good, for the well-being of sort of older people and people using that technology. So yeah, I think there's so much information there. I mean, it just, older people need to be included within the design process, and not just by smaller companies designing sort of assistive technology for older people, but from the tech giants, you know, from people who are designing this everyday technology that we use, this everyday technology that we're now reliant on, and more reliant on thanks to COVID as well. You know, it needs to be usable. We need that voice within there when things are designed, definitely.
I'm thinking now about the governments and institutions, especially maybe during COVID, forcing us to be more dependent on all these technologies, but not providing us with the help and assistance to get started with it. That's left sometimes. I know in Sweden a lot of people go to libraries and the librarians help out, and that's the way it's solved. But
if they're even open pair in your country, because
right,
they might be closed and locked down
right.
because of COVID. So, yeah.
But there's a responsibility here that somebody's not taking responsibility for pushing people into the technology.
Absolutely, and I think that's the biggest issue. Was we were all put into lockdown, and so many things went online, and so many things relied on technology, but we still have this digital divide. So there's still people who cannot afford Wi-Fi. There's still people who cannot afford technology, and there's still people who haven't had the technical experience, haven't had the experience of using technology, and so either need to learn it and learn it quickly, which is an extremely daunting thing to do, especially in isolation on your own, you know, or there's a people who just end up not using the technology. And I think what's quite interesting is that, looking at the statistics, the digital divide has reduced since COVID, because you get some people who maybe didn't use technology who were forced into using it, but they had a support network there to help them. So they had friends, they had grandchildren, they had family, all getting them online and making sure, you know, they were using things like Zoom or family WhatsApp. But what it's done is it's left a group of people even more isolated. So yes, the numbers of the digital divide have reduced, but the people who are divided are more alone and more isolated. So I'm doing a study at the moment on older adults using social media during the pandemic. And what we're finding is a lot of people who were maybe part of a community. So one example is there was this gentleman's drinking club on a Tuesday night, and they used to go down the pub and have a pint on a Tuesday. And it was great. They sort of had this interaction, they had this little group and had this community. But then when the pandemic hit, they needed to rethink things. So they went to Zoom and set up their drinking club on Zoom. And there were a few members who hadn't used much technology and hadn't used Zoom before. And, some of the friends from the drinking club helped them get onto Zoom and helped them use that technology so they could all drink together. But then there was one or two who just didn't manage to use that technology. And I asked a few of the members, what's happened to those people, and they're like, I've not heard from them in a while. Like sometimes I'll ring them on the telephone, but I really don't hear much from them anymore. And that's so sad. This group of people that used to meet up and have a drink, and now it's been sort of split into people who can use technology and people who can't. And I guess my fear is that when things open up again, I mean, they have a little bit, is that it doesn't go back to normal again. People don't go back to the pub and don't have that sort of interaction. It does sort of end up turning more into technology based, especially whilst people are trying to be safe.
I mean, that example is a worrying example, because it for me, it shows how easy it is to jettison parts of a group that aren't fitting in anymore. I mean, this was a group of friends who went drinking every Tuesday, yet they still managed to reach that point where, no, we're throwing two over the edge. I'm exaggerating a little bit now, but see my point, that they formed a new group, and they basically let the others who weren't part of that new group drift, and those friends were willing to, or were ended up in a situation where that was possible. When we scale that out to society, then you're right about it feels like you're very right about the people that are excluded now are definitely more excluded. We're almost abandoning them.
They're becoming invisible. As long as I benefit, I'm okay. I don't have to think about the people who aren't even using the technology.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I should say that group really did try and get everyone onto Zoom. So, and then they did make sure that they rung the person who wasn't on it. But I still think that sort of group interaction is so important, and that the person who wasn't involved would miss out on the group interaction. They might be able to speak to someone on the phone, but they wouldn't get sort of the group interaction that you would do down a pub. But you're absolutely right. That's just a small group of people, but that would be happening sort of everywhere. But then there's the other side of it, in that the stories coming out where, I used to ring my daughter in Australia, but I never used to use video call, and I don't know why. Because now we've got COVID, I've started using video call, and it's amazing. I can have her face up in the living room, and I can talk to her, and we can have lunch. So there are those lovely stories as well coming out of people sort of learning and changing their technology habits during lockdown. But it's that small, that isolated group, and as you say, they almost become invisible because our society is so dependent on digital technology. It's everywhere. Like as I mentioned earlier, you have to use digital technology, to get the train, to do your banking, even to access health information, or to have your sort of video call with your doctor.
And that thing about ringing relatives in Australia, I think you will talk about this in the report, about how that behaviour is grounded in a long history of having that behaviour. That person has always rung the people in Australia. Video calls were just not something that was possible, not something that was in their mental model of how it is to communicate with people in another continent. So getting them to go over that transition to that new world of technology, which isn't actually that much different perhaps to what they were used to. It's just not the same. It's not what they recognise.
Yeah. And it was almost like so what I'm seeing in this new study I'm doing is this kind of snowball usage, I'm calling it. It's like oh, well, my daughter was on WhatsApp, so I went on WhatsApp, and then we invited my husband, and then we invited, the grandkids, and it kind of snowballs. So it's like, oh, my daughter started using Zoom, so I started using Zoom, and it's kind of like, and it snowballs, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and people might not have been aware of that technology, or that technology was there, because the habit was to maybe sort of call someone, because that's what we're used to doing. But interestingly, actually, when doing these most recent interviews, a lot of people said that they would go back to what they used before. So they were like, yes, we understand the importance of social media and video calls, but there's nothing like face-to-face interaction. And some people were like, what's wrong with a phone call?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna be interested to see what happens now. So do people continue with their COVID habits, or do people change? I think one or two things will be picked up, like, for example, the video calling in Australia. But I think I hope a lot of things will go back to normal. I agree. I think there's nothing like face-to-face interaction.
Snowball usage. I like that. Thank you so much, Carolyn. I feel there's hope, as long as we don't forget to bring people with us as we progress.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Carolyn, for joining us.
Thank you.
Oh, even though during that chat with Carolyn, we've surfaced a lot of issues and challenges with tech and older adults, there's a whole load of areas, I think, where I can get a bit excited about the opportunities.
Yeah, I agree.
To make all this stuff better and to reach more groups of people. I mean, cause sometimes when we have these kind of chats, and it feels quite depressing at times that we bang on about the ethics of it, or the kind of how people are excluded, how it's kind of impacting that group in a bad way and so on. But despite the fact we've highlighted a lot of impacts that are maybe not, and there was a few examples and stories a lot during this interview where you kind of, your heart beats a little faster and you go, oh my word. But I do feel excited, actually.
Yeah. No, I agree. And also, I think it's part of it is that we are actually getting older as well. And we are seeing things that we perhaps as 24-year-old engineers didn't see. I remember many years ago when you and I started talking about font sizes, because we both realized, well, the font sizes that we used previously when we designed didn't actually work for us as we grew older. And so just that insight that, wow, what a huge difference tiny things can make. What makes what I've thought about a lot now when listening to Carolyn also is how many, when we joke about the elderly, or people make fun of the elderly and technology and how they're bad at using it, people don't actually consider that they themselves will grow older. They will become those people. I think that we're being extremely naive in thinking that, well, I know technology now, so I will know it in the future, not realizing that they will also have to deal with people who are 40 years younger than them building technology that really don't care about them anymore.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that this isn't a new phenomena for
exactly.
humans. It's always been a problem. I mean, I suppose in some societies and communities, then the elders, the wisdom of the elder was more respected. And Carolyn brought up the whole thing with respect, the knowledge and wisdom of the elder ones. But we've always fought with this problem of different generations and respecting the different generations and making use of that vast pool of wisdom, of knowledge, of life experience, of perspective that exists out there.
Yeah.
But another thing that really fascinates me about this is all these, the layers, the complexity of the layers. I think that Carolyn brought up a few points that. She said she just wanted things to be able to. You just turn it on and we can get it to work. When you're helping, it doesn't have to be older adults, but when you're helping someone who needs help with technology, to be a bit more inclusive, I guess, you just want it to work, and you need when you have a new device, you need an account, like she said, and often nowadays to have an account you need an email, and then you have to set up an email, or to read email you need a device. So you end up in a bit of a loop there. then we also went into, well, okay, if you've got a device, then you also need battery.
Yeah.
So we've just got layer after layer of quite complex hurdles that we're throwing in the way of people, and the sequence of things that need to work is huge.
I do appreciate, like you were saying now also, that all these paradoxes, Caroline was saying as well, they don't apply to just older adults. They actually apply to everyone. It's just that they were really evident in this research, but of course they apply to the whole population, which is really interesting. I loved the way that she really expressed how the things that are positive can also have a negative side. So there's two sides to everything. And I think this we need to acknowledge much more, because everybody's always talking about the benefits of the new technology. We always need to also express, well, what's the flip side of that? What will happen?
Yeah, the whole conflicting emotions side of this. I love the paradoxes. And there was a quote there too. Things just happen and you don't know why.
Oh, yes, exactly.
Which in some ways kind of really does sum up the modern life, I guess, with technology. I mean, even me and you think that sometimes every day. I mean,
we joke about it.
Utterly amazed at anything. Utterly amazed at anything works at all. That's one of the kind of how you damaged during the years of working with this tech. It's kind of incredibly flimsy. But that paradox of being reliant, being amazed, but at the same time, no idea how you got it to work or why it works.
And I totally laughed when inside, because I didn't do it out loud, obviously in an interview, but when she said, "What's wrong with a phone call?" Because my oldest son has moved away from home now, and we try to book all these sessions with him online with video meetings, and often he doesn't have time and doesn't want to do it. There's always a setup time, and we have to get the TV out and stuff. And of course, that's nice. What we've started doing now, actually, is we ring him. We just call him and see if he responds, and he picks up, and we talk. And it's like, why didn't we realize that before? How easy it is to just call someone. It's because he's a younger generation, and we think that's that's sort of what he expects. But just having a phone call is fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's strange how new normals become normal so quick. I mean, I was touched as well by the story of the gentlemen's drinking group.
Oh yeah, that was very touching. Yeah,
where they couldn't gather meet on the Tuesday, so they went digital, and how a group of them fell by the wayside. And they didn't just ring them either. Even that group didn't think of continuing in the old way, or do it other ways, or just kind of doing the simple thing. It doesn't have to be complicated.
Right,
sometimes.
A group call on the phone would probably work better.
But if there's one ultimate takeaway from all of this, is just that perspective side of things, that really having much more understanding, respect for the current knowledge of where someone's coming from when they are using your product. And it's everything, it's not only kind of their age, it's their experience, it's what they're used to. I think it's wonderful that Caroline brought up the example of think of who the user of your technology is, in the sense of what are they used to in their world. If you're used to having maybe a traditional telephone, an old school like telephone with a cable and all the rest of it, a handset that we used to have in decades ago, then that's how a telephone is for you, in your mental models in your head for that particular person. When I set up Google TV with my mum during Christmas, and the onboarding process of that was just so amazingly young person, perhaps with a family or whatever, that it was just mind-blowing how unsuitable it was for sitting there with an elder adult and trying to set it up.
And I do think something we actually do have to bring up in another episode, bring someone in to interview around, is this aspect that Caroline mentioned lots of times, of how this security issues are making everything so hard to use. I think that's, and she's as she's saying, it's actually getting worse.
You're quite right. That's one of those. I think a lot of us battle with that all the time. That kind of balance between UX, usability, or business, and security.
Yeah.
That's a really hard balance, that one.
So what should people listen to next? I think you found something from, was it 6 years ago?
It's almost just over 6 years ago. Well, today's topic is very much about inclusive design, not just about the older adults. So I thought maybe a good idea is to go back and listen to episode 118. So, as you said, 6 years ago. That's when we talked to Sarah Larian about inclusive design.
Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side.
James, I recently released my own fragrance.
Your own fragrance?
Yeah, but no one in the car seemed to like it.
Oh,